Okay, so you know how we were talking about curiosity and interest?
Yeah.
Well, you sent over some really interesting stuff, and we decided to do a deep dive into it. Specifically, that 2019 paper by Mary Ainley, Curiosity and Interest, Emergence and Divergence.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's really going to help us understand, I think, why some people are just like always chasing the next new thing,
Right.
and others just like get so laser focused on, you know, one specific thing and just like go so deep on it.
Yeah, exactly. And like how those two things, curiosity and interest, they seem so simple on the surface.
Hmm.
But when you actually start digging in, you realize how intertwined they are and also how distinct they are.
Yeah, definitely. And especially, when it comes to learning, like how does that all play out?
Right.
How do we go from, that fleeting moment of, huh, that's interesting, to a lifelong passion for something,
Absolutely.
to like really get us going here? We're going to explore this idea that like that initial curiosity we see in babies,
Right.
that like urge to touch everything and explore, it's actually setting the stage for those really deep interests that we develop later in life.
Yeah.
But we're also going to uncover some kind of surprising ways that like your general level of curiosity
All right.
and those very specific interests you have can actually operate pretty independently.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Yeah. So Ainley kicks things off in her paper by looking at the very beginning. Like, where do curiosity and interest even come from?
Yeah. So it all goes back to like those early years. And you know what? The foundation really is exploration. If you
Sure.
think about an infant, right? They encounter a new toy. What do? They're going to touch it. They're going to put it in their mouth. They're going to turn it over. They're going to bang it, all that stuff.
Right.
And Dewey actually had this really great way of describing this, way back when, with his 3 levels of emerging curiosity.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So the first level is what he called organic curiosity, which is basically what I just described, that physical exploration.
Right. So it's like babies are learning about the world through their senses, like directly, hands-on.
Exactly, exactly. Hands-on, very much in the moment experiencing it. And then as they grow, they move into the social level of curiosity.
Oh, so that's probably when the why questions start, right?
Oh, yes. The never-ending why? But that's a good thing. It means they're engaging, right?
Yeah.
They're engaging with others. They're asking questions to try to understand the world around them, the people, the things. So their drive to explore expands from just physical objects to the social world.
Okay, so they've got the physical, they've got the social. What's the third level?
The third level is intellectual curiosity. And this is where it starts to get really interesting because now it's this independent drive to figure things out on their own,
Oh, wow.
to seek answers internally. So they're not just relying on other people to tell them. They want to figure it out for themselves.
So in those early stages then, the experience of being curious about something and being interested in it almost feels the same, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Ainley highlights that in infancy, both curiosity and interest kind of look the same from the outside.
Okay.
There's that intense focus. There's that positive feeling, that sense of engagement.
Yeah.
And that active exploration of whatever it is that has captured their attention. They're just drawn to it. And surprise, that plays a big part too, doesn't it?
Totally. Like think about even a baby playing peekaboo.
Exactly.
That moment of surprise when the face reappears, it's like pure joy.
Yeah.
And then they want to do it again and again and again.
Exactly. Repetition. It reinforces that. And, going back to some of the research, like Divergence work with those impossible events, like the train going through the box, it's fascinating how that surprise, when something doesn't make sense, really focuses their attention.
Yeah. It's like their brain's trying to make sense of it.
Exactly. But then as we grow older, things start to change a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Our curiosity and our interests, they kind of branch out.
Yeah. It's not just everything's new and exciting anymore.
Exactly. And we start to see how differently people approach novelty in general.
Yeah.
And also how deeply they engage with particular subjects. So it becomes much more individual. And this is where Ainley brings up this idea of trait curiosity.
Oh,
Have you heard of that?
Yeah, I have. It's like your baseline level of being curious, right?
Exactly.
So how inquisitive are you as a person?
It's that consistent tendency to be curious, to get curious in situations that are new to you, uncertain, surprising. Remember Berlin, He talked about something called collative variability,
Yeah.
which is a fancy way of saying all those things that are novel and complex and kind of make you go, huh.
Yeah. So some people are just naturally more drawn to those things than others.
Exactly. They just have this inherent kind of itch to explore the new, the puzzling. It doesn't even have to be a specific thing. It's just that sense of the unknown that draws them in.
Okay, so that's trait curiosity. And then we have individual interest. So how does that differ from this more general curiosity?
Yeah. So individual interest is a lot more focused. Okay.
It's not just about novelty anymore.
Right.
It's your tendency to really engage and keep coming back to a very specific topic or domain.
And the key difference here is that it usually builds on something that you're already familiar with. It's like you've got some kind of foundational knowledge, some positive experience with that subject.
Right. So like it's not totally out of the blue. You already have some kind of connection with it.
Exactly. It's almost like, trait curiosity is that wide lens. You're exploring the unknown in general, right?
Yeah.
Whereas individual interest is like you're zooming in with a telephoto lens.
Okay.
You're really honing in on something specific. You've made that connection, you care about it, and you want to go deeper.
Okay. So we've got these two things kind of separating out as we get older.
Right.
But it seems like even though they're distinct, they still kind of work together.
They do. They do.
Yeah.
Especially as our interests develop, curiosity and interest kind of feed off each other.
Right. And Ainley talks about this concept of curiosity questions, which is really where they beautifully reconnect.
Okay, so what are curiosity questions?
So as our interests start to take shape, right, we get more familiar with a topic, we start to learn more.
Yeah.
And inevitably, we're going to bump into something that doesn't quite make sense.
Right. Or there's a gap in your knowledge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Something sparks a question. And that's where curiosity kicks in again.
Okay.
We start asking those curiosity questions. We actively seek out more information, but within that area that we're already interested in.
Okay, so your interest is like guiding your curiosity in a way.
Exactly.
You already care about it, so you're more motivated to fill in those gaps.
And this goes back to what Engel calls the paradox of curiosity and interest.
Oh, interesting.
We tend to be most curious about the things that we already have some connection to, some level of interest in.
Okay. That actually makes a lot of sense. Do you have an example of that?
Yeah, well, Ainley brings up a great one. Kids and dinosaurs. Think about it. They get fascinated by dinosaurs, right?
Yeah.
That becomes an interest. And then it fuels an endless stream of questions like, why did they have long necks?
Right. What did they eat?
How did they become extinct? All of that. It all stems from that initial fascination. And that's just one example, but you see it everywhere.
Yeah.
And Ainley also talks about curiosity episodes that happen throughout the lifespan of an interest.
Okay. What are curiosity episodes?
Well, Amon and his team suggest that they can happen at any stage.
Right.
As your interest develops, you might hit a point where you're like, wait, I don't understand this. Or, this is really intriguing. I need to know more about this specific aspect.
Oh, so it's like these little bursts of focused curiosity within your larger interest.
Exactly, exactly. And the cool thing is, when you resolve these puzzles, when you find the answers to those questions, it actually deepens your interest even more. So it creates this really cool, positive feedback loop.
Oh, that's fascinating. So if we were to observe someone in the moment, someone who's super curious about something versus someone who's really deeply interested in a topic, they might look pretty similar, right?
Yeah, they could.
Like focused, excited, exploring.
Exactly. They're both engaged, they're asking questions, they're seeking out information. But what's going on underneath, the reasons behind those behaviors, the knowledge they're drawing on, those can be totally different.
Okay, so there are like two different paths that can lead to a similar outward expression.
Precisely. And Ainley points out that both curiosity and interest share those observable features, right? Heightened attention, positive emotions, and that exploratory behavior that's directed at the object of their curiosity or interest.
Right.
But the underlying mechanisms, the way our brains are actually organizing that information, that's where trait curiosity and individual interests really start to diverge.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's like the why behind the what.
Exactly.
So can we go back to babies for a second? Because Ainley mentions how they have all these natural attention biases.
Yeah.
Like they're drawn to bright colors, sounds, movement, faces.
Yeah, babies are naturally drawn to all those stimulating things.
So how do those initial attractions actually relate to how curiosity and interest develop later on?
Well, those early biases are like the building blocks of learning, right?
Okay.
They guide the baby's exploration, helping them figure out what's important in their world, what's interesting, what they should pay attention to. You know, Gopnik and her colleagues have this great analogy. They talk about babies being like little scientists,
Oh, I like that.
constantly testing hypotheses about the world.
Yeah.
And those initial attractions are what drive those early experiments.
So it's like they're primed to notice things that will help them survive and learn.
Exactly. And then there's that element of surprise again, right?
Right, because babies are always making predictions about what's going to happen.
Exactly. When a baby sees something that violates their expectations, like in Belargen's classic train experiment, they show increased attention, they show surprise. And that surprise is a huge motivator for them to try to figure out what's going on. They want to resolve that discrepancy.
It's like their brains are saying, wait a minute, that's not how it's supposed to work. I need to figure this out.
Exactly. And you know, Izard's work emphasizes how positive emotions like interest and joy are actually intertwined with this whole process of early exploration and learning.
So it's not just about figuring things out, it's also about enjoying the process.
Exactly. And Ainley connects these early infant experiences, that focused attention, that anticipation, the surprise when things don't go as expected, and those feelings of interest and joy to the first phase of Hedy and Renninger's four-phase model of interest development.
Okay, so this is getting a little more technical. What's the four-phase model?
Right. So Hedy and Renninger, they came up with this model to describe how interests develop over time. The first phase is called triggered situational interest. It's that initial spark, right? Something grabs your attention, it's new, it's surprising, it's enjoyable.
So like those moments we were just talking about with babies.
Exactly. And then there was this study by Renninger and Wozniak where they observed preschoolers, and they found that these early interests in kids, you know, ages 2 to 4, they were marked by these repeated patterns of preference for certain objects or activities. So they would keep going back to the same things. They would spend more time exploring them.
Okay, so it's not just a one-time thing. There's this sustained attention that starts to emerge.
Exactly. That's when it starts to look like, okay, this could be an interest developing here.
All right, so we've covered babies and preschoolers. What about when we get older? Ainley talks about these studies with college students using trivia questions. What can those tell us about curiosity?
Yeah, those studies are really cool. They actually give us a glimpse into what's happening in the brain when we're curious.
Oh, wow.
So often they use neuroimaging, like fMRI. And what they found was that when people are really curious about a trivia question, even before they know the answer, certain parts of their brain light up.
Interesting. Which parts?
The parts associated with reward anticipation.
Oh, so it's like your brain is actually treating the possibility of getting new information as a reward.
Exactly. It's like, ooh, I'm going to learn something new, and that feels good. And this is all happening before you even know what that new information is. It's the anticipation that's driving the reward response.
That's amazing. So it's like our brains are wired to seek out knowledge and enjoy the process.
Yeah, and that makes sense evolutionarily, right? Like
Right.
being curious, seeking out new information, that would have been beneficial for our ancestors.
Yeah.
It would have helped them survive and thrive. So it makes sense that our brains would have evolved to find that rewarding.
That's fascinating. And it seems like when we're in that state of high curiosity, we're also more willing to put in the effort to get the information.
Absolutely. There's research showing that people are willing to spend more time. They'll even give up small rewards just for the opportunity to learn the answer to a question they're really curious about.
So it's not just a passive feeling.
No. It actually drives you to action.
Yeah. And I guess that also explains why we tend to remember things better when we're curious about them.
Exactly. That heightened curiosity, it enhances memory. It's like that anticipation creates a stronger imprint in your brain.
Okay, so we've talked about this kind of quick burst of curiosity, like with trivia questions.
Right.
But what about the kind of curiosity we feel when we're engaged in more long-term learning?
Yeah. Like reading a book or working on a complex project.
Right. How does that curiosity play out over time?
That's a really interesting question. And Ainley highlights some research on extended learning activities like reading and writing.
Okay.
For example, Boscolo and his colleagues did these studies where they looked at how people felt while they were reading and writing. And they found that feeling curious was one of the things that made the whole experience more interesting.
Oh, so curiosity is a factor in how much we enjoy a learning activity.
Yeah, exactly. And interestingly, that feeling of curiosity could actually change over time. It wasn't always constant.
Oh, that's interesting.
So it could intensify at certain points and then maybe subside as you learned more and then maybe spike again when you encountered a new challenge. It's dynamic.
So it's like curiosity can be this kind of thread that weaves in and out of our experience of interest. especially when we're engaged in something for a longer period of time.
Exactly. And it's not just about that initial spark anymore. It's about this ongoing process of exploration and discovery.
Okay, so we've talked about curiosity as this kind of in-the-moment feeling,
Yeah.
but let's zoom out a bit and talk about curiosity as more of a stable characteristic, something that's kind of a part of who we are.
Okay.
We talked about trait curiosity earlier, but I'm curious to learn more about what research has found about it.
Okay, so trait curiosity, as we mentioned, it's this stable tendency to seek out new information.
Yeah.
And it seems like even really early in life, things like a mother's own curiosity can actually predict how much her child will explore.
Wow, really?
Yeah, there's a study by Sachs and Stolak that found that.
Interesting.
And it's not just about the mother's level of curiosity, it's also about how she reacts to her child's exploration. If she encourages it, if she gets excited about new things with her child, that also seems to make a difference.
So it's like that early environment, the way caregivers respond to a child's natural inquisitiveness. It shapes their curiosity.
Exactly. It can really nurture or stifle that natural inclination.
And how do researchers actually measure trait curiosity, especially in children?
Well, they've got a few different tools in their kit.
Okay.
They use parent questionnaires, where they ask parents about their child's behavior.
Okay.
They create these really neat activity boxes, sometimes called curiosity boxes, with all kinds of unexpected elements to see how kids react.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, it is. And sometimes they'll even just observe kids in everyday settings. Like there's this great study by Fortner, Wood, and Henderson
Right.
where they just watched kids in a grocery store.
What were they looking for?
They were watching how the kids interacted with unfamiliar objects. Like, did they touch them? Did they look at them? Did they ask questions about them?
Oh, that's clever. Just observing their natural behavior in the wild.
Exactly. And all these different approaches give us a more well-rounded picture of this underlying trait.
Okay, that makes sense. And it seems like there's been a growing realization that trait curiosity isn't just one thing.
Right. It's not just like you're either curious or you're not. It's
Yeah.
more nuanced than that. There are different facets to it.
So what are some of those different facets?
Well, some researchers, for example, talk about breadth versus depth of curiosity.
Okay.
So breadth is like you want to experience a lot of different things. You're kind of a sampler. Depth is you get really focused on one thing and you want to go deep. You want to understand all the intricacies of it. And then there's also this distinction between perceptual curiosity, which is about being drawn to sensory novelty, new sights, new sounds, new smells.
Okay.
Epistemic curiosity, which is that drive for knowledge and understanding, and even social curiosity, which is wanting to learn about other people, their lives, their experiences.
So we're not all curious in the same way.
Exactly. And one really interesting model is Kashdan's multidimensional model of curiosity.
Sure.
He talks about things like joyous exploration, which is that feeling of excitement and pleasure you get from discovering new things.
Yeah.
He also talks about deprivation sensitivity, which
Right.
is like that feeling of discomfort when you don't know something, it kind of bugs you. You really want to fill that gap.
Right. And then social curiosity, that was one of his dimensions too, right?
Exactly. So there's not one right way to categorize all the different aspects of trait curiosity. But I think what's important is that we recognize that it is multidimensional.
So how does this understanding of trait curiosity, with all its different facets, how has that been used in education research?
Well, a lot of the research in education has focused on epistemic curiosity, that drive to gain knowledge and understanding,
Okay.
because it's so closely tied to learning.
Yeah.
For example, Kashdan and some of his colleagues, they found that students who score higher in epistemic curiosity, they tend to do better in learning environments that they perceive as intellectually stimulating.
So it's not enough to just be curious. You need the right kind of environment to support that curiosity.
Exactly. It's like a plant needing the right soil and sunlight to thrive. If a student is naturally curious, but their learning environment is really rigid and doesn't allow for exploration or questioning, then that curiosity might not translate into academic success.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Ainley also mentions that these different dimensions of trait curiosity, they can actually interact in complex ways.
Yeah, that's an important point. We often study these dimensions separately. But looking at how they work together within individuals, that could be really informative. It's what we call person-centered analysis.
So like instead of just saying, this person is high in breadth of curiosity, we might say this person is high in both breadth and depth, or this person is high in breadth but low in depth, and see how those combinations play out.
Exactly. It gives you a much richer understanding of how curiosity operates in the real world.
And I know technology is also playing a role now in how we study curiosity.
Oh, yeah.
Like how are researchers using technology to study those in-the-moment states of curiosity.
Yeah. So we've got all these amazing tools now, like eye tracking, where we can actually see what people are looking at in real time,
Uh,
and physiological measures like heart rate, skin conductance that can tell us about their emotional responses. And all of this allows us to get a much more detailed picture of what's happening when someone encounters something that piques their curiosity.
so we can actually see those curiosity-driven behaviors as they unfold.
Exactly. And then we can relate those behaviors back to their trait curiosity. So we can start to understand how those underlying tendencies influence their immediate reactions.
Okay, so we're moving from just asking people, how curious are you, to actually observing and measuring those curiosity-driven behaviors in real time.
Yeah, and it's also opening up the possibility of understanding how people might shift between different types of curiosity during learning.
Oh, interesting. Like between those interest type and deprivation type states we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Like maybe someone starts out with that interest type curiosity. They're just really enjoying exploring a new topic. But then they hit a point where they feel like they're missing some key information and they get that feeling of deprivation, that urge to fill in the gaps. And by tracking these shifts over time, we can get a much more nuanced understanding of the learning process.
This is all super fascinating, but how does this research on curiosity compare to the research on individual interest?
Yeah, so there is a difference in how researchers approach those two concepts. Trait curiosity, we tend to see it as a more stable personality characteristic, something that's relatively consistent over time.
Okay.
But individual interest, it's often described as more of a predisposition or a disposition. It's a little more flexible.
So what does that mean?
Well, Heedy and Renninger, they emphasize that individual interest isn't as fixed as a personality trait. It's
Ah.
more like this dynamic organization of your feelings, your knowledge, your values, all related to a specific area.
So it can evolve as you learn and experience more.
Exactly. And Krapp and Sylvia, they view interest more as an emotional or motivational tendency, like a leaning towards certain topics or activity.
Okay, so it's not just about what you know, it's also about how you feel about it.
Right. And the methods that researchers use to measure individual interests, they're also a bit more diverse.
Okay.
So you see things like naturalistic observation, where they just watch people engage in activities related to their interests.
Okay.
They'll use parent questionnaires, asking parents about their kids' passions.
All right.
They'll do self-report surveys where people rate their knowledge, their value, their enjoyment of different topics.
Okay.
And they'll also look at behavioral indicators, like how often someone chooses to engage in a particular activity.
So they're trying to get at it from multiple angles.
Exactly. And interviews can also be really helpful
How so?
because you can actually talk to people about how their interests developed, what sparked them, how they've changed over time. It gives you a much richer, more qualitative understanding.
But that makes sense. And it seems like there's this ongoing question about whether that initial spark of situational interest feels the same for somebody who already has a strong individual interest in that area.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question that Ainley brings up. It's like, is it the same kind of aha moment for someone who's already passionate about a topic?
Right. Or is it different because they already have all this background knowledge and emotional connection?
Exactly. And some researchers are using some pretty fancy statistical techniques to try to tease apart the different sources of variation in interest. Like Nogler and his colleagues, they've been using something called latent state trait analysis, which is a mouthful.
Yeah.
But basically, it helps them separate out those different components of interest. The stable individual interest that someone has, the interest that's common across situations, and the interest that's very specific to a particular moment.
Okay, so it's like they're trying to create a more precise map of the interest landscape.
Exactly.
So all this is fascinating, but how can we actually use this knowledge to make learning better, especially in schools?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah. And Ainley mentions this observation by Engel about how there's surprisingly little evidence of curiosity in many classrooms, which seems like a huge missed opportunity.
It really is, because if you think about it, curiosity is the engine of learning.
Right. It's what drives us to explore, to ask questions, to make connections.
Exactly. And Engel emphasizes that teachers have a really important role to play here.
Okay, so what can teachers do to cultivate more curiosity in their classrooms?
Well, they can start by modeling a questioning approach themselves. Like instead of just presenting information as fact, they can frame it as a question, as something to be explored and investigated.
Oh, so it's about showing students that it's okay to not know everything, that asking questions is actually a good thing.
Exactly. And teachers can also encourage their students to ask questions, to be curious about the world around them.
So it's about creating a classroom culture where curiosity is valued.
Precisely. And this goes back to what we talked about earlier about how parents and teachers can nurture that natural inquisitiveness in children.
Right. It starts with that early encouragement and support.
Yeah, and teachers can also use specific strategies to spark that initial situational interest in their students.
Okay, like what? Give me some examples.
Sure. Research has found that a few things can be really effective. Introducing novelty and surprise, like maybe presenting a problem in an unexpected way. Connecting the content to real-world human activities or universal themes that students can relate to. So it's not just abstract knowledge, it's something that matters to them.
Yeah, it's got to be relevant to their lives.
Exactly. And then providing immediate enjoyment or novelty in subjects like physical education.
Okay, so like making it fun and engaging.
Right. And in problem-based learning, carefully structuring those problems so that they're challenging but not overwhelming.
So it's like finding that sweet spot where they're motivated to figure it out, but they don't get discouraged.
Exactly. And even in areas like aesthetics, Sylvie's research has shown that the perceived novelty and comprehensibility of something can influence whether we find it interesting or curious.
Okay, so it's about how our brains make sense of the world around us.
Exactly.
But as we've been talking about, that initial situational interest, it can be fleeting.
It can. It's like that first spark.
So what can educators do to help that spark grow into something more sustainable, a deeper, more lasting interest in a subject?
That's the key, right? Turning that initial spark into a flame.
Yeah.
And technology can actually be a really valuable tool here.